Stop trying to talk to him. Stop analyzing his texts. Stop asking him what he's thinking. And stop trying to pull him closer when you feel him slipping away. Every time you push for clarity, you trigger a primal mechanism in his nervous system that makes retreat his only logical option. When an avoidant man pulls back, your brain tells you to bridge the gap. You send the paragraph, you ask the question, or you change your tone to sound softer, hoping to make him feel safe. But to a human mind wired for avoidance, your attempt to connect doesn't register as love. It registers as a threat to his autonomy. You are applying pressure to an internal wall, and the harder you press, the thicker that wall becomes. Here is what most people never realize. Avoidant men are not immune to connection. In fact, their entire defensive posture is built around a desperate need to protect themselves from being controlled. When you try to fix the distance, you validate his underlying dynamic that intimacy equals a loss of freedom. You become the force he must resist to survive. So how do you penetrate a system designed to shut you out? You don't do it by arguing, and you certainly don't do it by pleading. You do it by changing the fundamental state of the interaction without saying a single dramatic word. There is a precise behavioral shift, a specific nonverbal recalibration that completely flips this dynamic. It circumvents his psychological defense system entirely. Instead of pushing him away, it creates an immediate sense of intrigue and destabilizes his expectation of control. The moment you execute this shift correctly, his brain undergoes an immediate reevaluation. The distance he created no longer feels like a victory, it feels like an unsettling loss of leverage. If you leave this room or close this presentation right now, you will keep running the exact same playbook that guarantees emotional distance. You will keep firing off signals that confirm his subconscious beliefs, driving him further into his shell. Stay with me for the next few minutes, and I will show you the exact mechanism behind human attachment behavior, why your default instincts are failing you, and the precise single action that dismantles his defenses from the inside out. Let's look at what is happening under the hood when a man pulls away. Human behavior is governed by threat assessment. When an avoidant personality senses an increase in emotional vulnerability, their sympathetic nervous system interprets that proximity as an impending loss of control. Their heart rate spikes slightly, their posture tightens, and their visual focus narrows. They aren't executing a conscious strategy to hurt you, they are retreating into a psychological bunker. Most people respond to this bunker by knocking on the door. They ask, "Is everything okay?" Or, "Did I do something wrong?" That is an absolute tactical error. When you demand emotional inventory from a person in threat response, you escalate their perceived loss of control. You become the pressure point. If you want an avoidant man to soften, if you want him to drop his armor and seek proximity, you must alter the pressure balance instantly. The one thing you must do is execute strategic non-engagement paired with complete physical grounding. This is not the silent treatment. The silent treatment is passive-aggressive, carries intense emotional charge, and sends clear distress signals. Strategic non-engagement is entirely different. It is the deliberate removal of all emotional demand while maintaining total physical calm and neutral presence. When he steps back, you do not follow. You do not show frustration, you do not alter your vocal cadence, and you do not offer reassurance. You drop your shoulders, lean back, slow your speech rate down by 20%, and return completely to your own axis. You give him absolute spatial and psychological freedom. Here is why this melts his defense system. An avoidant mind relies on your reaction to justify its retreat. When he pulls away and encounters zero resistance, zero chase, and zero tension, his threat model breaks down. The wall he built has nothing to push against. Within hours or days, the psychological vacuum kicks in. Because you didn't pursue him, his brain moves out of threat response and into curiosity. He begins to wonder why his retreat didn't trigger your anxiety. The perceived power balance shifts completely. Suddenly, the distance is no longer his refuge, it is an isolation chamber of his own making. By doing less, you bypass his biological armor and trigger his natural drive to return to you. Avoidant behavior is not a random personality trait, an intentional choice to inflict pain, or a sign of cold indifference. At its foundational core, it is a deeply wired, subcortical survival mechanism designed to treat emotional intimacy as an immediate threat to individual control and autonomy. To truly understand why an avoidant individual acts the way they do, you have to look beneath the surface level of daily interactions and examine the fundamental architecture of their threat response system. Early in their development, an avoidant person learned an unconscious lesson. Reliance on others leads to vulnerability, and vulnerability leads to an unavoidable loss of self. Their subconscious mind linked closeness with danger, constructing an internal blueprint where emotional exposure is equivalent to giving away the steering wheel of their own life. Consequently, when an intimate relationship begins to deepen, their nervous system does not register warmth, safety, or connection. Instead, it registers an incoming psychological invasion. The physiological machinery that triggers when someone steps too close emotionally is identical to the reaction activated by physical danger. Their baseline heart rate increases, cortisol and adrenaline enter the bloodstream, muscle tension subtly increases across the jaw and shoulders, and their visual focus narrows as their brain seeks an exit route. They enter a state of fight or flight, but because social norms prevent physical fight, their system defaults entirely to flight or freeze. This manifests as sudden emotional detachment, abrupt changes in communication patterns, brief or delayed responses, and an overwhelming internal urge to create distance. What looks like coldness or arrogance on the outside is actually a desperate, involuntary attempt to regulate an internal system that feels completely overwhelmed. When they pull away, go quiet, or retreat into work, hobbies, or isolation, they are executing a protective routine to lower their internal arousal levels back to a manageable baseline. They are trying to regain psychological space so they can feel safe inside their own mind again. This is why standard attempts to bridge the gap, asking them to open up, confronting them about their distance, or pushing for emotional clarity invariably backfire. To an avoidant nervous system, those efforts are not perceived as invitations to connect. They are perceived as continued pressure on an already compromised perimeter. Every demand for emotional performance confirms their deepest fear, that being in a relationship requires them to sacrifice their autonomy to satisfy someone else's emotional demands. The defense mechanism demands absolute self-reliance as a fortress against external control. Understanding this baseline reality changes everything about how you interpret their actions. Their retreat is never about your worth, your attractiveness, or the quality of your communication. It is entirely about their own tolerance threshold for intimacy and their non-conscious need to preserve their boundaries at all costs. Until that perceived threat to their autonomy is removed, no amount of logic, pleading, or emotional reasoning can force their defenses to lower. Their brain will prioritize safety and control over connection every single time, treating any attempt to draw them out as an active threat that must be neutralized through further withdrawal. The instinct to pursue when someone you care about begins to pull away is one of the most powerful and deeply ingrained human responses. Yet when applied to an avoidant mind, it becomes a catastrophic tactical error. When you sense distance opening up in a relationship, your own nervous system registers that shift as a signal of relational instability and impending abandonment. The natural mammalian impulse in that moment is to bridge the gap instantly. You reach out, you send the long, explanatory text message, you ask probing questions about what changed, or you alter your tone to become softer and more reassuring in a desperate attempt to make the other person feel safe enough to return. However, from a structural and neurological perspective, every single one of these pursuer behaviors produces the exact opposite of its intended effect. When you chase, question, or attempt to over-explain the dynamic, you force an avoidant brain into an immediate and severe state of psychological lockdown. The avoidant mind operates on a fragile balance of autonomy and perceived safety, and it views any external emotional demand as an aggressive breach of its defensive perimeter. When you step toward them while they are trying to create distance, their nervous system does not interpret your actions as love, care, or a healthy desire for connection. Instead, it categorizes your pursuit as a direct threat to their self-sovereignty. The subconscious calculus running in their mind tells them that you are attempting to consume their energy, force them into emotional performance, and strip away their control over their own internal state. As a direct result, their primary threat response mechanism, the fight or flight pathway, is fully activated. Because fighting is socially costly, their system defaults entirely to flight, causing them to retreat deeper into their defensive fortress. The harder you push for clarity, reassurance, or dynamic resolution, the thicker and more impenetrable their internal wall becomes. What pursuers fail to realize is that by chasing, they inadvertently validate the avoidant person's core limiting belief, that intimacy is an exhausting trap where their boundaries will never be respected and their autonomy will inevitably be erased. Your pursuit provides them with the precise justification they need to rationalize their retreat. They look at your anxiety, your questions, and your emotional intensity, and they tell themselves that their decision to pull away was completely necessary for their own survival. You effectively become the external pressure force that validates their internal bunker strategy. Furthermore, excessive pursuit completely destroys your leverage within the relational field. It signals to the avoidant individual that you are entirely focused on their emotional state, that your stability is dependent on their validation, and that you will actively absorb the burden of maintaining the connection while they remain entirely passive. This dynamic eliminates any natural incentive for them to step forward or examine their own behavior, because you are consistently over-functioning to fill the space that their distance created. Instead of inspiring closeness, your pursuit reinforces a vicious cycle where your increasing anxiety fuels their deepening avoidance, creating a self-sustaining feedback loop of emotional starvation and total relational paralysis. The single action that radically shifts the relational dynamic with an avoidant man is the immediate, disciplined execution of strategic disengagement. When an avoidant person pulls back, their entire defensive architecture is braced for impact. They expect you to pursue, demand answers, project anxiety, or attempt to manage their emotional distance. Their psychological system is actively waiting for that pressure so it can justify its retreat and solidify its internal walls. Strategic disengagement completely disrupts this anticipated pattern. It requires you to consciously withdraw all emotional demand, conversational forcing, and energetic pursuit, while simultaneously remaining grounded, composed, and non-reactive in your own physical presence. This is not to be confused with passive-aggressive withdrawal, silent treatment, or calculated coldness, all of which carry an intense, detectable emotional charge that an avoidant brain easily identifies as covert manipulation or hostility. Strategic disengagement is the total absence of emotional friction. It means you stop asking what is wrong, stop sending clarifying messages, stop adjusting your behavior to appease their distance, and completely drop the internal drive to fix the gap between you. By withholding emotional pressure while maintaining absolute personal stability, you effectively strip away their threat baseline. You stop giving their nervous system a target to fight against or run away from. When there is no external force pushing against their boundaries, their internal alarm system encounters a profound absence of danger. The immediate result of this shift is the total bypass of their primary defense mechanisms. Without the pressure of your pursuit to focus on, the avoidant brain can no longer use your behavior as a rationalization for its retreat. The protective wall they built suddenly has no functional purpose because there is no incoming invasion to block. This creates a powerful neurological reset within their system. As the perceived threat to their autonomy vanishes, their sympathetic nervous system shifts out of its defensive baseline and returns to a state of equilibrium. For the first time since they began pulling away, their cognitive resources are freed from threat monitoring. Furthermore, this deliberate removal of emotional pressure creates an immediate psychological vacuum. In human interactions, energy and focus always seek balance. When you step back into your own axis with calm self-possession, the space that was previously filled by your pursuit, anxiety, and bids for connection suddenly becomes completely empty. Because you are no longer over-functioning to hold the relationship together, the avoidant individual is left entirely alone with the silence and distance they created. Their brain, no longer occupied with defending its borders, naturally turns inward to assess the new reality. They are forced to confront the actual cost of their withdrawal without the comforting buffer of your constant availability. The absence of your emotional noise allows their underlying desire for connection, which was previously smothered by their fear of control, to surface. By mastering the discipline to do absolutely nothing when every instinct tells you to fix the problem, you disarm their evolutionary armor, restore your own behavioral power, and create the precise psychological conditions required for them to naturally move back toward you. The mechanics of neural recalibration represent the precise point where the psychological balance of power flips within an avoidant dynamic. When you eliminate all emotional demands, remove energetic pursuit, and cease providing reassurance to a retreating partner, you trigger an immediate structural collapse of their expected reality. The avoidant mind operates on an unconscious mental model that relies on your predictably anxious reaction to validate its own defense strategy. They expect you to chase, query, or display emotional distress, because that predictable reaction serves as the primary metric by which their subconscious measures its own control over the relational field. When that expected emotional baseline is suddenly removed, a profound psychological vacuum is created in the space where your anxiety used to exist. This vacuum acts as a direct catalyst for neural recalibration, forcing the avoidant individual's brain to abandon its threat response architecture and transition into a state of cognitive reevaluation. Without the incoming emotional noise of your pursuit, the perceived threat to their autonomy instantly dissolves, leaving their defensive mechanisms with nothing to resist. Their brain can no longer frame their withdrawal as a necessary defense against your overreach, because there is no overreach occurring. As a direct consequence, the distance they created loses its purpose as a protective fortress and transforms into a realm of acute social and psychological isolation. The subconscious reward loop that typically accompanies retreat, the feeling of relief from relief of pressure, fails to materialize. Instead, the sudden absence of your focus forces an immediate drop in their perceived leverage and relational standing. The avoidant brain is accustomed to holding the upper hand by simply threatening or executing distance, knowing that you will overfunction to fill the void. The moment you step back into absolute self-containment and emotional neutrality, their internal calculus is fundamentally disrupted. They are forced to confront an unexpected reality where their distance does not cause you to panic, but instead causes you to recalibrate your own attention away from them. This shift triggers a powerful cognitive dissonance within their system, prompting them to reassess who actually holds the emotional agency in the relationship. Because human minds are naturally wired to seek equilibrium and avoid the silent loss of status or connection, their neural pathways begin to actively process the potential reality of your permanent detachment. The focus of their thoughts shifts entirely from defending their personal space to evaluating the immediate cost of their own behavior. The psychological vacuum you created exerts an invisible pulling force on their cognitive processing, compelling them to monitor your state rather than their own defenses. They begin checking for subtle signals of your attention, searching for any sign that their emotional control remains intact. When they find only calm, unbothered self-possession, their brain experiences a sharp recalibration of value. The scarcity of your emotional output dramatically increases its perceived worth, dismantling their habituated patterns of withdrawal and forcing them into a state of active internal pursuit as they seek to restore the dynamic that previously guaranteed their security. The nonverbal shift represents the ultimate physical implementation of strategic disengagement, operating at a level that bypasses conscious thought and speaks directly to the primitive nervous system. Words are easily filtered, rationalized, or met with skepticism by an avoidant mind, but body language, vocal acoustics, and physiological microsignals bypass cognitive defenses entirely. When an avoidant man detects even the slightest disconnect between your spoken words and your subconscious bodily state, his internal threat detection system instantly flags the interaction as unsafe or manipulative. If you say you are fine, but your jaw is clenched, your chest is tight, or your vocal pitch is slightly elevated, his system registers that hidden tension as emotional pressure and immediately reinforces his defensive walls. To bypass this evolutionary security system, you must master the art of subtle physiological calibration. This begins with complete mastery over your physical frame and vocal baseline. The moment you register his distance, you must deliberately drop your shoulders away from your ears, release the tension in your hands and facial muscles, and slow your overall movement speed by roughly 20%. Your vocal cadence must slow down, dropping into a lower, more resonant pitch that carries zero upward inflection at the end of sentences. An upward inflection signals a bid for approval or a question waiting for validation, whereas a flat, warm, low-pitched tone communicates absolute internal stability and lack of demand. Furthermore, you must regulate your visual engagement and spatial orientation. Rather than leaning forward, angling your torso directly toward him, or maintaining intense, expectant eye contact, all of which signal high focus and implicit demand, you lean back slightly into your own chair or space. You adopt an open, untroubled posture that signals complete comfort with whatever space currently exists between you. You look at him with relaxed, neutral eyes that convey warmth without urgency or silent interrogation. This specific combination of stillness, lowered vocal resonance, and relaxed physical presence acts as an immediate neural down-regulator, for his hypervigilant brain. Because his subconscious is constantly scanning your physical body for signs of covert anxiety, anger, or desperate pursuit, encountering total physical composure forces a complete recalibration of his threat assessment. The complete absence of predatory or needy body language deprives his defensive system of any target to react against. His sympathetic nervous system, deprived of any incoming distress cues from you, is compelled to stand down from its heightened state of alert. As his physiological arousal drops back to baseline, the psychological armor that felt so essential moments ago suddenly becomes heavy, unnecessary, and counterproductive. The subtle shift in your bodily state completely alters the energetic tension in the room, stripping away his defensive orientation and replacing it with a quiet, persistent intrigue. Because your physiology communicates that you are entirely secure on your own axis and completely unbothered by his retreat, his brain is forced to process a new reality in which your presence is no longer guaranteed. This profound shift in physical signaling completely neutralizes his urge to flee, triggering a deep internal recalibration that transforms his defensive posture into an instinctual urge for proximity and emotional pursuit.